Welcome to Footnotes to Endnotes. This is your communizateur radio hour. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov, aka the inverted form.
My name is Owen Gilbride, aka Huron Gilbride. Is that the
Duong,
French way
what?
of what would be the French way of saying my name? I want to sound more
Uh,
continental.
I think there's no. I don't know. What's the French version of Owen?
You am.
You
That's how
maybe.
French people. I'm sorry, French people probably listening. They probably all have turned off
Yeah, I think
broadcast already.
most listeners have turned off at this point already. All right, so we're here to discuss a essay from the New Institute for Social Research. It's called Theses on the Council Concept. Wow. The New Institute for Social Research. That means that these people are the new Frankfurt School. We're reading an essay by the
Yeah.
new Adorno,
Holy
Horkheimer,
shit.
Habermas. Who else is in the Frankfurt School? Korsch, is he in the
Uh,
Frankfurt School?
Walter Benjamin's associated
Yeah,
with Frankfurt School.
not really part of it. But yeah, this is new Adorno. New Adorno just
Oh
dropped.
my god.
Oh my god. Wow. Spoiler alert, it's not quite at that level.
Yeah.
It's a bit vainglorious for these people to be calling themselves the new Institute for Social Research, but it's a pretty good name and a nice website, nice web design.
Yeah.
Very minimal, but yeah, looks good. All right, so before we get into the essay, or as a means to get into the essay, before we started recording, oh, and you're enlightening me about the concept of the mega machine,
Hmm.
which you encountered in the writings of Deleuze and Guattari. Where did you encounter it? And can you give us a bit of a gloss on what exactly that means?
Okay, so the idea of the mega machine, in my understanding, it was originated by the American sociologist, philosopher, architect, prolific writer of the early 20th century, Lewis Mumford. Now, I will say at the outset that I have not actually read anything by Lewis Mumford. I have not even read Lewis Mumford's Wikipedia article. So any Lewis Mumford scholars out there, prepare to get salty because I'm probably going to get a lot of stuff wrong. However, I have encountered reference to Lewis Mumford in a number of texts that I've read. As you mentioned, Deleuze and Guattari draw heavily from his work, especially in Anti-Oedipus, which is their first joint album that they did back in the 70s. Their controversial philosophical text where they talk about pissing and shitting for the entire first 3 pages. Um,
It's
he's
good
also
stuff.
he's also referenced by Jane Jacobs in her seminal text on urban design, the death and life of great American cities, which, in my understanding, has been like one of the major influential like architectural and urban planning texts of the last half century. Um, so yeah, like I said, I haven't read his work, but I have been introduced through secondary resources to his concept of the mega machine. My understanding, what he means by the mega machine is that basically when you're looking at like like anthropological like studies of history and like the evolutionary course and specifically the technical development of the human race, uh, the problem with that is you're primarily looking at like artifacts that have been found, like old stone tools and spears and like carved art pieces and things like that. And that's all we have to really go off of for evidence of like the development of like technology is like the actual tools and like physical implements that have been left behind. But what Mumford argues is that just as important, if not more important than these actual tools, would have been like the psychological shifts that were happening in the human species and culturally in order to facilitate the development of tools. Like his argument is that you would have needed distinct shifts to happen to go from basically like, an animal walking around just kind of one to one with nature to like a being that could actually like look at its environment, see objects in the environments, and like recognize that it could do things to them, that it could change them in order to like get certain utility out of them. And not only to do that, but to do that like in a replicable way, to like, have this tool that basically corresponds to the idea of like an axe or a hammer, and to recognize that the axe is like an abstract idea that could be reproduced with certain techniques and certain like resources. So he has this idea of the mega machine, which basically refers to like the way in which like large groups of human beings are organized in order to like do anything at the social level. So like the example I used before we recorded is that, say you were like the pharaoh trying to like build a pyramid, right? Like before you even started thinking about like the actual things you would need to build a pyramid, like how you would move like the big ass stones and like all of that, like before you started thinking about the actual vehicles and tools and whatnot, you would need to figure out a way to actually like get like many hundreds or thousands of random people to like spend hours and hours a day working on the pyramid, and how to like feed them. Like you would need all of this kind of like societal infrastructure. And that's basically, in my understanding, the mega machine is like the kind of abstract organizing principles that allow like a complex social organism to emerge, which then produces all of the tools, cities, cultural forms that we are familiar with.
I guess that like an army would qualify as another kind of example of this, because in order to support like a large troop of people, you'd also need um, a large troop of people who are like working in conjunction, doing like one thing, fighting a battle. You'd also need a lot of like support utilities, to keep it functioning. Um, but yeah, I guess that this concept of the mega machine, we can relate it to the concept of the council, which is what we are here today to discuss. Reading an essay called "Theses on the Council" concept, because this mega machine is a bunch of people acting in coordination, and the council is supposed to, at least as it is elaborated in this essay, it's supposed to refer to um, like the relational process of people, acting together in a communist society, free from compulsion by the value form. So just like the mega machine, refers to the coordinated activity of a large group of human people for one particular purpose, so too the council refers to this kind of I guess there's a distinction here, because the mega machine is about it kind of like takes the all of the people, this social organism, as like a distinct unit, and as like a tool, but the council is supposed to be like a relational process. It's supposed to be something that is never really closed. Like it doesn't have like a closed form like a tool, for example. So you wouldn't really refer to it as a machine. You wouldn't conceptualize it in that way, even though the council is like in this framework that we are thinking about, council communism. It's supposed to be like the organizational form by which society at large, at scale, is able to reproduce itself and produce its needs. um, it's still like open ended. It's not like a closed thing. It's as the author of this, the anonymous author of this essay, mentions, it's supposed to be like a relational process, which really brings us back to a lot of what Endnotes have been saying as well. Like it fits very well into the communization framework of viewing, society, viewing like a class as well.
Okay, so I haven't read too much like literature on like the concept of council communism, so I'm mostly just going off of like what I got from this essay. Like my understanding or how I'm interpreting this idea of the council is like basically in like the communist utopia that's like outlined in this essay, like there's a suggestion of getting rid of like the class relation, right? Like where you're basically getting rid of this like social dynamic where like the masses of human beings are coerced into like performing certain functions by like a select group of elite, like the capitalist class or the ruling class or whatever, in order to maintain a social structure. And communism wants to do away with that class relation. It basically wants to create this like radically egalitarian society where everyone's equal and everyone can like freely self-determine like how they go about living their life. At the same time, it's presumed that like most people don't just want to descend into like total primitivist anarchy where like you're basically just left to fend for yourself. There's no social structure at all. Because like the idea of a communist society is it's still a society. There's still like, some sort of like recurrent, organized like interrelation between people. There's still like something beyond just like being an animal living in nature. Like there is like cultural forms and organizational forms and like roads and stuff like that. So I guess the council concept is how do you deal with that process of organization? How do you like figure out these things that require like the coordination and division of labor of a large group of human beings, and perhaps like doing jobs that aren't necessarily pleasurable or enjoyable to most anyone, but would still be something that people would want to see done, like having garbage picked up and having like functional sewers and things like that. It's this idea that you would need to figure out a way to organize all that. And the question of the essay seems to be, how do you do that without just creating a new class structure, a new like ruling class that is kind of like determining how to like organize society and then telling everyone like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And you just got to do it. You just got to put up with it. It's like, it seems to be related to finding a balance between just saying like, okay, everyone do whatever you want. Like, we're just going to have like anarchy and it's just going to magically like work somehow, or having like just a new control infrastructure. That was my first impression of the essay anyway.
Right, and the important point to make about the council as a concept, as an organizational quote form, is that it is open-ended. It is meant, like, again, like it's a relational process, as this author says, and as Endnotes have said repeatedly. So the form of it is not closed. It's going to be constantly developing in need, or in, to meet the needs of the people who compose it. Um, but it's at the same time like meant to perform to some degree the same kind of function as a mega machine, which is, um, again, it's like a bunch of people working in tandem to like accomplish some greater goal than any kind of individual can um, you know do, building some great project that will not necessarily even benefit any particular individual, but will benefit society as a whole. Um, you know, something like a pyramid or some kind of infrastructure. Um, so the council is supposed to meet the same need, but I guess like the examples of the mega machine given so far are armies and like slave societies, slaves that built the pyramids, which are obviously not the kind of social forms that we want to be reproducing. um, I think like, yeah, I mean the machine to me, it's like a closed form. It has like a distinct form, and it's a tool that is used to perform some function or other, whereas the council is its own end as something that is open and changing, it is its own end. So you're not like participating in the council in order to, get some kind of infrastructure done, but you're participating in the council because that is like, the way that society is like that is the way in which you have social intercourse with other people is by participating in the council. So I think that's kind of the idea here. And then, I mean, obviously, that gets into, like breaking down the distinction between labor and play, which is like an important part of imagining any kind of like socialist utopia. But I think like before we kind of like get into it further, one point that I want to make, one of the like the form of this essay, if you want to call it that, is like a bunch of numbered paragraphs. I think there are like just over 30. It's fairly long, about as long as like your average Endnotes piece. um yeah, it's published anonymously on this website. I guess all of their writing is published anonymously. And like pretty early on, one of the points, they talk about like social fiction and how like some, I guess, communist theory takes the or communization theory especially maybe takes the form of like social fiction, kind of like imagining the worlds of tomorrow or whatever. um and I think that a fair amount of this essay is that like it's kind of it's not thinking about like revolutionary strategy or like how to organize the people or analyzing some like struggle that has happened in the past or is ongoing. It's not, thinking about workers' identity or like analyzing capitalist crisis or anything like that, really. It is specifically thinking about the concepts of the council and how it will um, be relevant to a communist society. It's like a form of social fiction and thinking about um you know like how communism is going to look, how it would need to look. What do you I think we've like kind of discussed this a little bit before, but and I think we might have discussed it in our last episode maybe, but yeah, my feeling is that like I would like to read more of that kind of stuff. Maybe we discuss this off mic anyway, but like that kind of social fiction can be nice and like refreshing. I'm not I mean, it might have just been like the form or style of this essay, but it didn't really satisfy me, my desire to like read that kind of like like elaboration of what communism could look like. Did you find it satisfying in that way, Owen?
Not really. Like, I mean, no offense to the author, but I didn't feel like I got a whole lot out of this piece. Like, it felt rather underdeveloped in my opinion, because I feel like if we're specifically looking at like the idea of like speculative, like I don't want to use the term utopian, but like trying to imagine like a world that you would rather inhabit and like the kind of infrastructure that would be there, without necessarily feeling like compelled to like list off every single pragmatic step that would need to be taken in order to get there, because the simple truth is that like if we already knew the exact steps to take to get there, it would like probably be happening already. It's like the whole reason why these things are difficult to move to is because it's like a complex process of actually moving there. So what I would be hoping for with any sort of like speculative fiction like this is like at least like something outlined that seems like a fully realized world, like something where you can actually kind of like imagine it and like actually imagine living in it. It's like kind of got like a fantastical element. It's like something different than what you currently experience, but it still has this quality of like realizability to it, where like, you read this speculative piece and then you're thinking like, okay, what would that actually look like? How would like my life have to be different than what it currently is. Like, how would I be different? How would my social interactions be different? And I think like the real value of something like that is it's like you start to imagine like the kind of shifts you would need to make. And maybe you do start to notice some things in your own life. You notice some steps you can take to make your actual lived experience be even a little bit more like this world you'd like to inhabit. With this piece, I didn't really get that. Like, I felt like there was a lot of like suggestion of what needs to be done, but not really like a sense of it being something that could actually happen. Like, when I hear the idea of a council that would figure out how to organize people in order to like complete complex social projects, in order to like maintain a large scale society in which people have like a certain degree of expectations for comfort and like sustainability and stability. um all I really got from reading this was like the recognition that like, yeah, that's a really complex problem without like a clear sense of like a proposal for like what a solution to that problem might actually look like.
Yeah, what I will say is that I didn't really find myself so much like disagreeing with this essay. The concept of the council that they are describing seems to be like very much in line with the general like political program, if you can call it that, that Endnotes have uh, elaborated so far. Um, and insofar as I'm like trying to approach that political line with an open mind and kind of not disagree with it, like I didn't find myself disagreeing with the idea of the council. I found it more or less amenable. I thought it made sense, whatever. But most of my like problem with this essay comes down to the style and the format. Like it's a bit difficult to follow, and like again, like I kind of am thirsty for social fiction of the sort that they're trying to do here. And I think that the principle upon which they are doing the social fiction is agreeable to me, but it was not particularly well executed. So it didn't really satisfy what I am looking for in that sort of writing. I guess why did I make us read it when there's so much other stuff? Like we're doing all these bonus episodes before we get into Endnotes 5, and the more I look, the more stuff that there is to read. Like I found this, whatever, some other very interesting essays that we should be reading. There's so much to read. Maybe we'll never get into Endnotes 5, but I just, first of all, I'm intrigued by them calling themselves the New Institute for Social Research. And, I just kind of like found it floating around on Twitter and just felt kind of intrigued by it and had not read it in advance before I suggested us reading it, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, what I thought maybe we could do is spend a bit of time trying to elaborate our own social fiction of what a communist society would look like. Um, there's this need to, as the authors of this essay rightly recognize, as I think everybody rightly recognizes, there's the need for like complex organizational forms that can kind of like execute, you know, like big tasks, big kind of like infrastructural tasks that require a lot of people working in unison, working for some kind of like a greater end, So we need some kind of like organizational form, and the council, it's kind of I guess it's pretty like anarchistic to me. Like it reminds me a lot of like anarcho-syndicalism, where you have like workers who are like, you basically have like concentric federations of people, not necessarily specifically workers, but you have like neighborhood councils, you have like workplace councils. You have basically councils anywhere people are meeting and like doing something together. And they kind of like decide what is going to happen with whatever it is that they're doing. So it's kind of decentralized. It's like a grassroots, from the bottom up. And this idea of the council kind of reminded me a lot of that. I guess it's kind of like in distinction to some kind of like centralized vanguard party or like party led form of communism. But yeah, I mean, what do you think, Owen? Like in the communist utopia you dream of, do you think that there will be some kind of like a politburo that is kind of like coordinating activities, or is it going to be this kind of like councilist form of organization where people are, I don't know, determining their own, I don't know, like what does this council mean to you, and how do you think that it would manifest itself in some kind of like post-revolutionary society?
Well, that's like, the two scenarios that I see as possibilities for like a post-revolutionary society is, on the one hand, if you maintain something like what we have today, in the sense that there's like this kind of like global communicating network where basically like, we're moving more and more towards like a global society of everyone interacting with each other. Um, which like seems to be in large part a product of like technological development. Like as you develop things like the internet and like transportation, like you're just inevitably going to reach this point where you're kind of aware of like what everyone on the whole planet is doing, and also like individual actors anywhere on the planet could do things that like affect the entire ecosystem. Like someone can like do something in one country that causes so much pollution that it could cause like detrimental effects for the entire world. Um, so like if you were going to maintain like something like that, which like every like practical consideration like makes me think that that would be the case, that you would still have some sort of global society, I think you would very much need like large scale organizational forces. Like I don't know what that would look like necessarily, if it would be like one centralized force, if it would be like many decentralized forces communicating with each other. The other alternative, which like I could only really see happening with like widespread environmental catastrophe or something like peak oil being reached and just like a massive depletion of like energetic resources, would be like some sort of aversion to like small nation states and isolated communities which only like concern themselves with a small geographic area. And then even then, if you didn't want to just have like widespread anarchy, you would probably still have like some sort of organizing principle. Um so like I'm trying to think of what that organizing principle would look like and what it would entail, because like specifically in this essay, the author seems to be promoting this idea of freedom and like the eradication of the class dynamic. And I'm trying to figure out like exactly what they mean by the term class and the term freedom, because like those two terms, I feel like they both have a specific feeling. Like people know what freedom feels like, and they can like know what it feels like to be like subjugated by like a ruling class. Like this, it's something that's widely understood, but I think we need to like highlight like the negative aspects associated with class and the positive aspects associated with freedom. Because obviously, when we talk about freedom, we're not just talking about like total anarchy, no structure whatsoever, no organization. Like there would still be some sort of cohesion to society. There would still be some, sense of like people working together, and that would necessarily entail someone having to do something they don't necessarily want to do, or things that like just left to their own devices they would never actually do. So I think the real question isn't so much like how do you promote more freedom, as how do you reorganize society in such a way to overcome like for lack of a better term, the spiritual crisis of modernity, where like people feel locked into this like system that's just increasingly like mechanizing the world, and like making it more like artificial and rigid and like structured in a way that isn't enjoyable for a human being to live, how do you move away from that feeling to a society in which like it actually feels like the work you're called upon to do is like making the world better, making the world like more holistic and enjoyable and exciting for someone to live in? Like, to me, that's the primary question of any sort of revolution. Is it's like not so much a question of like how do you actually alter like the physical structure, like in terms of like, oh, how are you going to provide for like energetic needs better and like deal with environmental catastrophes? That's all important, but that's to be left to the specialists and the people who actually have studied these things in depth. It's like, how do you actually change like the motivating forces that are currently compelling people to like just try to like get rich and like endlessly develop technology at an increasingly rapid rate with like complete disregard for like the balance of like the planet? How do you shift that? How do you like instantiate like a new sort of like organizing principle? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that I mean, my thought on this question of overcoming the spiritual crisis of modernity is that, like, I'm kind of with the communisateurs on this. Communisateur, by the way, is the term introduced in this essay to refer to what we had previously been calling communizers. It's basically somebody who is a communizationalist or whatever. I don't know where it comes from or why they're using it. It just seems like hilariously pretentious. Maybe it's just like an untranslated term taken from theory communist.
Theory
Those hilarious, I don't know, group name when you say it just in English. Theory communist. So funny. Anyway, my thought in terms of overcoming this spiritual crisis is that yeah, I'm with the communizers in this, that like once or if and when some means of overcoming capitalism, some means of like the proletariat, or we don't use that term within this tendency. Once the people like figure out how to, like, what form the revolution is going to take, you know what I mean, like what form this new kind of social organization is going to take, once they figure out how to actually do a revolution, like that thing is going to occur spontaneously in the middle of some kind of struggle against capital.
Mm.
And I feel like it is going to be very exhilarating. It's going to be more or less immediately apparent, like the potential of it as an organizational form. And it's going to, like, take the world by storm. Like, I
Mm.
feel like it's going to, yeah, it's going to be very exhilarating, and everybody is going to want to be a part of it, and everybody is going to feel like the potential of a communist society. They're going to like feel themselves unburdened with this need to work a shitty job and like live in absolute misery and turmoil, and they're going to, like, feel like joyous and liberated, and like that process, whatever that form is going to um, also at the same time be the means by which people feel motivated to participate in some kind of new social structure. That's my personal feeling. Like, like people are so downtrodden and miserable. If a genuine like revolutionary prospect, something that emerges out of the people's like self-directed activity, and which is which they can, then I think the people would be able to tell using their magical people sense that it is a genuine opening, like a genuine new formal possibility or whatever. Like everybody's going to be very excited. They're all going to want to get on board and lift themselves up out of the misery. Like people are going to want to be liberated from the chains. They have nothing to lose but their chains, as the great man once said. So yeah, that's my thought on that. Like the question of how people are going to feel motivated to participate in communism, or whatever. I think it's going to be that. Like once we've basically overcome. I mean, the other thing is that obviously any revolution is going to require um, like a defection, as is said in this essay, from the repressive state apparatus, meaning that like the military and the police are going to need to be taken over by this new like force as well, because otherwise they're going to crack down, and then all our energies will be spent in conflict with them and they'll win. So like as with any revolution that has ever happened in history, there's going to need to be like a defection from the military particularly, and probably the police as well, um, over to the side of the uh, you know over to the side of the people. I don't think that's too hard to imagine. Like it's a bit difficult to imagine with the police, especially given how inundated we are with anti-police propaganda. Like to me, the police seem like a totally alien kind of like just evil, malignant force. Um, but the military, I think, is made up of of a lot of like normal people who are for one reason or another, they're like patriotic, or they just like a lot of people join the military, just like a lot of people join the police as well, out of like economic desperation. So I think there are a lot of normal people in there, and I think it's somewhat realistic to me to imagine people defecting from the military, or the what do you call it, the reserve, the reserves, the National Guard or whatever. Is that just an
National
American
Guard,
thing? Yeah, I think
something like
like
that. Yeah.
yeah, it's it's feasible to me that like a bona fide like revolutionary moment causes people to like leave what would otherwise be like a repressive state apparatus, and join with the side of the people. And it's really like the cops that we need to watch out for. um
I would say like the majority of people, for like no fault of their own, even like people in the police and the military, have not spent like a great deal of time actually like considering the minutia of like complex social structures, right? Like they have a fairly like underdeveloped and basic understanding of how society works. Like you can go through the entire mandatory school system and even university without developing a particularly like nuanced idea of like what the structures in your society actually represent. So I would have to imagine that there's like a lot of people in the police and the military who got into it for like perfectly valid emotional reasons. Like they just wanted to like protect what they thought of as like the good, like their nation, their country, their like, everything good in the world. They wanted to be one of the good guys protecting the world from the bad guys. Like just because that's what they were brought up in, that's what they were conditioned to view the world as, right? Like, everybody's affected by this like organizing propaganda. And so they're conditioned into a certain worldview, and they might take on a certain role, which you might view as negative, as like antagonistic. But that doesn't mean that fundamentally they're like bad people. They're like someone that like knows exactly like the problems they're causing in society, and they're like, they want to cause those problems. Rather, they kind of just fall into this role. And like you say, I think like if you had some way of like showing them that there was something else possible, that there was like some other structure they could like move towards that would allow them to fulfill the function that they would like to function, which is like, being one of the upholders and defenders of like the things they see as good and valuable in society. If they were shown like a system in which they could more like functionally fulfill that role without falling into any of the antagonistic roles that they currently inhabit, like I think a lot of them, if they truly believe that was possible, would move to it. Which like brings me to the broader point, which I agree with a lot of what you're saying, where I feel like the masses of people, if they genuinely felt like there was something new and better and more satisfying, like some new way of organizing society, they would like immediately and willingly move towards it. Like I think like the biggest issue is actually something that's brought up in this essay, and it's something that I brought up on this show before. The author talks about how like for the average person, they might not be particularly happy with like their life under capitalism, but there's this sort of like short-sighted like pragmatism to it, right? Where you're not like, it's not like you're sleeping outside on the ground, unless obviously you're homeless, which you know a lot of people are homeless. But like for the average person, it's like they have a place to sleep, they have food to eat, they have like a job they can work. It might not be a great job, they might hate it, but at least like their basic survival is taken care of. And because of that, like they don't want to necessarily participate in a revolution where it would seem like their life would get worse. Like they'd be moving to a position of like less comfort. Like people don't necessarily want to give up what they have just for like a philosophical ideal or like the promise that maybe things will be better 100 years from now. Like people want to like move to something that is immediately felt to be like at least no worse than what they currently have, and ideally like better. So I think like the real like communization question is how do you present like, you know, like a social model that's at once like immediately available and doesn't entail just like, you know, the large scale destruction of everything that capitalism has allowed to build up. How do you actually like offer that to people?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, on one hand, there are some things that you simply cannot have within communism. Like a lot of the things that the masses of people desire and have been trained to desire and think are natural and good are things that are unnatural and bad and which cannot be reproduced in a communist society. I'm thinking about like commodities that are just
Mm.
very harmful to the earth, and just in general the constant like flux of commodities, the constant like barrage of commodities. Commodity fetishism is something that we cannot have within capitalism. And I think that I mean, to me, this brings to mind like a number of different questions. First of all, there's like the general kind of left communist critique of your basic like communism in one nation perspective. The left communist position is basically that um, capital is a global system, it's a global network, and you can't realistically have communism in one nation because no nation is independent, really. So you have to have a communist revolution everywhere at the same time. So there's that. And then there, to my mind, like at least two kind of like phases of a post-revolutionary society. This is not to say there's like a transitionary phase of socialism and then a communist phase, but there's just at least like an immediately post revolutionary moment, and then there's like a more kind of medium to long term moment of kind of like what you're building for. So like in the immediate term, you need to recognize that obviously people need their necessities, which means that we need to continue to produce them using the harmful infrastructure that we are given by capitalism. um, I'm talking about like animal agriculture and fossil fuel industry and monoculture and all these sort of things that we will want to move away from, but which we will need to use until such time as we are able to dismantle them and build up new infrastructure. So in the more longer term, we would need to, no longer live in cities. We would need to like make everything like a big old suburb, like we were kind of talking about in our essay on our episode on urban structures and whatnot, like the kind of like idyllic suburb that we imagine, like connected, everywhere is connected by like really good public transit, and there's like community and you know like community gardens everywhere, so everybody is able to be like close to the food that they are consuming, which is what needs to be done. Like people need to be closer to the food that they uh, need, which is like the major point that Jasper Burns and I spoke about in my interview with him, and that he writes about quite a bit in his essay, The Belly of the Revolution, which is all about agriculture and all about this sort of thing. Like his two essays on logistics and agriculture are really kind of like in the background of this essay that we are talking about now. Um, Basically, to some extent, I think in a post revolutionary society, you kind of need to be like somewhat primitivist. Like the
Mm.
civilization, the technology, and the culture that we have now is bad, and we can't continue to have it. We need to tear it down a little bit, at least. This doesn't mean that we need to live, as the author of this essay kind of talks about, in some kind of like I don't know, monistic society where we're like abstaining from every kind of like pleasure of life or something. We're not all going to be like poor in communism, but we certainly need to like reframe what we think of as wealth, obviously, and like as as like a good. Like we simply can't have tons of like cars and the fossil fuel industry. We cannot have a new iPhone every year, obviously. We can't have like shitty fucking Netflix culture. We can't have like kiwis and pineapples flown in the middle of winter. Like we can't have that shit. We need to live in harmony with the natural environment to a much greater degree than we do now. And the left communist question of like a world revolution, I think it is a very important one. And in terms of like thinking about how like people are going to like adjust to an immediate like revolutionary situation, and like they're people are going to be like disgruntled that they have to like give up their new iPhone or whatever, or their like pineapples. um but at the same time, like if we are imagining like a global revolution, then like the workers in China are going to be revolting as well, the workers who make our iPhones. And they're going to like we're all going to be on the same side, and it would be like really unfair and unethical for people to like expect the workers in China to be producing our iPhones at their own expense, at like exploiting themselves, just so like workers elsewhere can continue to have their commodities. That's really selfish way of thinking. And I think that like global revolution is obviously going to require international solidarity. We're all going to be
Yeah.
on the same, need to be on the same page. We're all going to need to be compassionate to each other and understand that we can't expect to have everything that we have now. That doesn't mean that we need to live in poverty. Obviously, nobody wants to live in poverty. Like I think that there are plenty of technological and like commodity kind of like innovations that we could have in communism. We can have like plenty of like nice things. I like nice things too, and I think that we will still have them. There will be more time for people to develop nice things, but it's not going to happen at anybody's expense. It can't, because that is unethical and it wouldn't make sense within communism. So yeah, I mean, I think that we need to like think about this in a kind of international context. And like workers or people in like North America like doing a little revolution and then not wanting to like lose out on their like cheap goods that are produced by exploited workers elsewhere is just like a really bad framing of it. like it necessarily, we need to be thinking about this in international terms. We need to be thinking of, workers in other countries as our comrades who are also needing to be liberated, and with whom we can only achieve our own liberation in our own national context, like together. I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, this actually, everything you said made me realize like what my primary point of contention with this essay is. And it's this idea of like freedom, which, seems to be being promoted by the author as like something very important, this like freedom to self-determine. And like, going back to the point I said earlier about how like people, the masses, like who haven't necessarily like thought about like the social structure they inhabit or like the long-term like effects of their actions or their living style, don't necessarily want to move to a situation where they're less comfortable or they have to give up certain things. So like there's this idea of like, oh, well, could you do a communist revolution where you still provide for all of the stuff that people currently feel like they enjoy under capitalism? And the answer is basically no, because the whole point of the revolution is that you're going to be making some changes, right? You're going to like, you're not just reproducing capitalism under a different name. That would be like really dumb and just like a waste of energy and time. Now, like what exactly like the social structure under communism would look like, that's up for debate. Like, the level of like technological development you want to have, like the level of urban development, like how globally interconnected all is, like, whether or not you're going to be eating meat and like how you're going to be farming and like what sort of energy technology you're going to be using. That's stuff to be figured out by like specialists and like trial and error. But like there is this recognition that like some sort of change is going to happen. And so if you're going to have a revolution, necessarily like you're not going to be able to satisfy all of the current like desires that people have. Like you said, like there's going to be a lot of commodity desires and like certain sort of commodity experiences that will be given up because like the way in which they're maintained currently is like, not sustainable under like a communist model. But there's also like more abstract, like psychological, like motivating principles that we've been conditioned into. Like I'm specifically thinking of like this idea that in the West, at least in North America, there's like this constant like promotion of the idea that like the best way to self-actualize and like demonstrate your value as a human being is to just hustle really hard and get rich. Like, like to become like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or even like someone from like a rap music video or like Drake or someone where you're just like kind of showing like how powerful you are by like amassing great riches and like sort of openly like declaring like, basically just listen to any sort of modern music video and the singer is usually just openly declaring like how much power they have over the listener and like how much better they are as human beings. There's like this whole semi-conscious like psychological infrastructure that must be overcome if like we want to like instantiate like healthier human relationships. So like as I'm saying all this and recognizing that like for me at least in my idea of a revolution, that's stuff that I would like to see happen, like a shift of like desire and also a shift of motivation to something different. There's this recognition that that doesn't necessarily just happen when you leave people free to their own devices. Like this idea that people will freely self-determine like a healthier social model, to me that just seems idealistic. That seems like unrealistic because we've all been conditioned to like view the world in completely different ways. So if we want to actually have a revolution, there needs to be like promotion of new and different ideas. There basically needs to be like this like educational process, like and I'm like trying to figure that out because I don't necessarily want to suggest that like, like a small intellectual elite is going to come up with a new system and then basically like make their own propaganda and brainwash the masses into like participating in like some sort of new system, because obviously a whole bunch of like really dark revolutions of the 20th century basically use that exact model. But at the same time, I feel like there does need to be this kind of like redirecting of society. It's not just something that organically happens like in a democratic fashion if you just like leave the average person to like figure it out. Like, how do you actually do this? Is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, in fact, I think that a lot of people are going to be like resistant to it. Like, if you've ever had the experience of, I don't know, living with roommates, living in any kind of like communal situation, well, there can just you can get used to kind of like a frostiness, and like that kind of frostiness can be more comfortable, really. I mean, that is the situation that we are all locked into right now. It's a situation of atomized like unsociability, which we are comfortable in. Like, it's a rut that we're all stuck in, and breaking out of any kind of rut and becoming like properly social human beings, meaning that like participating in a community and not just like self-isolating every day, and retreating to our comforts and our little cells. Like, that is an uncomfortable process. It requires like breaking out of like a psychological mode. Um and yeah, people are going to be resistant to that for sure. Like, even, yeah, I mean, so what is the solution to that? I think, I mean, again, like, I imagine, like, I think of any kind of like street protests that I've been a participant in, and how kind of like exhilarating and exciting it can be, and like the energy and the spontaneity, and like the sense of like a community, being with people. And like, I know that I am not alone in feeling that, obviously. I mean, we have like every riot wave, every like thing that happens one place and then spreads everywhere else is like a huge testament to that. Like, this is obviously basic. Like, you know mass protest spreads when people feel the desire for it, and that kind of feeling that I'm describing is felt by a lot of people who are participating in these things, people who are not so jaded and cynical that they are like closed off to the possibility of experiencing community. There's a sense of exhilaration, there's a sense of like excitement in these kinds of movements, in these moments of mass action. And like, I think that kind of energy is what we need more of.
Mm,
That is what is going to break everybody out of their psychological mode. I think there are a lot of writers who talk about like carnival. I think Ivan Illich is one. But yeah, we need like a mass protests that are like party atmospheres that can bring out a lot of people, and basically just like get people um doing things together, and kind of like breaking people out of their ruts. We need like a return of community
mm,
forms of like socializing that are like exciting, and that can draw people in, and that are actually like obviously doing something and like making gains, such that people are motivated to continue participating in them, and so that these like things have like a real sense of excitement and possibility. I think, like, if we can, I don't know, capture that energy or like sustain it over an extended period of revolution, then that is what is going to help break people out of their modes. That is kind of like the like pedagogical thing that we need to like break this kind of atomization model that everybody is stuck in. Kind of like excitement, exhilaration shared with people, this kind of like a youthful kind of like vitality, everybody like running around together. It obviously, this doesn't all have to take the form of people like marching through the downtown of their city, although that is a perfectly fine model. Like, why not do that? It's, I
mm.
mean, it's basically a parade. Like, that's perfectly fine and good. But yeah, we just need more of that energy. I think that is what is going to help the people kind of like break out of their isolation. Just do that enough over a long enough period of time, and then like eventually everybody will kind of join in.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly it. I think that there needs to be like kind of a reconsideration of what exactly is like meant by the idea of the individual, because I think that like, well, obviously there's truth to the idea of the individual as we currently know it. There's also a lot of like conditioning and presuppositions that are loaded into terms like individual, free will, like liberty, like these concepts kind of condition you to view the world in a certain way. Like, I think it's become a real trend. It's like sort of a meme at this point for every like person under, let's say, like 40 to be anti-liberal, whether you're on the right or the left, or even like functionally a liberal, you like got to declare that you're anti-liberal. Like, I think this is almost like the default position amongst the younger generations. But like the impression I get is that few have actually really thought it through, like what it would mean to be kind of like anti-liberal or post-liberal, or at the very least to like articulate the current problems with liberalism. Because like in this essay specifically, I think there's a suggestion of like the individual having freedom to self-determine. And like my problem with this idea is that's like basically liberalism. That's basically like what we currently inhabit, is this idea that like, oh, everyone's just kind of like this blank slate. You're just like kind of like de-worlded soul who's just kind of objectively and rationally viewing everything. And you're presented with all the information data. And then you like think it over and you pick the best option, and like, you just consciously move forward, which is like not at all the case. I think the reality is that in large part, when left to your own devices, like what we refer to as freedom in the current like social apparatus that we inhabit is more or less just like, like sort of like cyclically engaging in like repetitive patterns that have been conditioned into us by like media and propaganda and peer pressure and like social normativity. And like it's all of this like semi-conscious and unconscious like inframing that we take on. Like our desires, our like understanding of how things work, our way of viewing objects and others and ourselves is like completely conditioned by the social model to such a degree that we don't even consciously recognize it anymore. And what we think of as like our individualist freedom to self-determine is in fact just like the unconscious like maintenance of social structures that if we actually thought about it, we wouldn't necessarily want. And like, I think there is like, complete possibility for anyone to inhabit like a completely different sort of social model and to take on completely different desires, which would be just as satisfying, if not more satisfying than the ones you currently have. Like there's nothing like objectively you in the desires that you have or the way you see the world. That's just like the model that you've sort of like internalized. So I think like, if we want to like promote like a genuinely like revolutionary movement, we need to be willing to overcome like this idea that like everyone is like consciously and rationally like determining what's best for them, and that like the current desires that they hold are actually like, good desires that need to be maintained and satisfied. Like we need to be willing to move beyond that. How do we actually do that? I'm not entirely sure, but I do feel like it's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to go back to the old. I feel like we're ending on a very like kind of raver and also like situationist kind of note here. Like what I was saying is very rave, kind of like rave theory, and now what you're
Okay.
saying is very like situationist. But yeah, let's finish it up on that note. Uh, well, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did enjoy it and you want to, support the show and make sure that we keep going, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the inverted form. Support us at $3, $5 a month, and you'll get an invite to our Discord server. Or you can also just send me a DM on any kind of any of the social medias, and I'll just send you a link. But yeah, hope you all enjoyed the show. If you did, yeah, you can also just we always appreciate any feedback that anybody has. So yeah, that's it. Owen, any last thoughts?
No, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. I don't really have any like final quips. You can find me on the internet at my website world3.tk. I've actually been uploading some new music to my web zone lately, so if you want to hear some tunes, they're all freely available on the internet at my website. Yeah, so I guess that's it. I'll see you all next week.
Yeah, see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.